The story of Rome and Parthia begins long before legions and cataphracts ever faced one another across the dust of Mesopotamia. It begins with the rise of two worlds, two civilizations born of very different soils, shaped by very different destinies, yet drawn together by the same inexorable law of empires. Expansion. In the West, Rome clawed its way from a cluster of villages on the Tiber into a republic that devoured Italy, then the Mediterranean, then sought beyond. In the East, the heirs of Persia, the keepers of Iranian traditions, rose from the steppes and deserts to forge the Parthian Empire, a kingdom of horsemen who built their power not upon cities and marble, but upon speed, cunning, and the vastness of the lands they commanded. Rome was iron, discipline, and law. Parthia was bow, horse, and the wisdom of survival in harsh lands. One stood for the solidity of stone roads and the codified order of the Senate and the people. The other drew strength from the shifting sands, the free mobility of the nomad, and the elusive power of mounted archers whose arrows could darken the sky. And between them lay Mesopotamia, the eternal crossroads, the land where empires collided for centuries. The same soil once fought over by Assyria and Babylon, Persia and Greece, Alexander and Darius. Now it would become the frontier where two new titans would measure themselves against each other. In the 3rd century before Christ, Rome was already pressing its might outward. The Punic Wars had shown the world what the legions could do, smashing Carthage, breaking its fleets, conquering Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Rome's appetite was insatiable, its population swelling, its aristocrats greedy for new land and glory. But Rome's gaze was drawn eastward too, where the wealth of the Hellenistic kingdoms beckoned. The successors of Alexander ruled in splendor, but their realms were fragile. Macedon fell, Greece bent the knee, and soon the Seleucid Empire, sprawling, rich but fracturing, became a natural target for Roman interference. It was from the carcass of this Seleucid giant that the Parthians emerged. The Parni, a nomadic people of the Iranian steppe, had drifted south, finding opportunity as the Seleucid grasp weakened. Under Arsaces the Hafars, they seized Parthia, a province in northeastern Iran, and from that foothold they grew into a dynasty. By the time Rome was stamping its authority across the Mediterranean, the Arsacid kings had carved out an empire stretching from the Caspian to the Persian Gulf. They embraced Persian traditions, styled themselves kings of kings, and became heirs to the legacy of Cyrus and Darius. They were not city builders like their Hellenistic rivals. Their strength lay in movement, in cavalry, in the vast open plains where armored horsemen could outmaneuver slower foes. Thus two very different empires expanded, almost unaware at first of the other's destiny. Rome's sphere grew in the Mediterranean, Parthia's in the Iranian plateau. But inevitably their zones of influence began to brush against one another. The Seleucids, weakened and shrinking, stood between them. As Rome pressed further into Asia Minor, as Parthia pressed further west into Mesopotamia, it was clear that the two powers would eventually meet. And when they did, the clash would not be minor. It would decide who ruled the East. For Rome, the East meant riches, grain, gold, silk, spices. The East was the dream of Alexander reborn, the lure of empires beyond the Euphrates. For Parthia, the West meant security. Mesopotamia was the beating heart of empire, a land of rivers and fertile soil, of cities that had endured since the dawn of civilization. To surrender it was to surrender their place as heirs of Persia. To hold it was to stand as the equals, even the superiors, of any power from the Mediterranean. And so the stage was set. The first embers of rivalry were already glowing as Rome absorbed Asia Minor and Parthia wrested control of Babylon and Seleucia. Each empire watched the other with suspicion, each testing the edges of the frontier. For the Parthians, Rome was something strange, a Western invader whose discipline seemed alien to the ways of the East. For the Romans, Parthia was a ghost of Persia, a horse-lord realm whose power could not be easily measured by cities and census. Neither side yet understood the other, but soon they would. It was not yet open war, but already Rome's leaders dreamed of bringing the Parthians to heel. The Roman elite read the histories of Alexander, measured themselves against his exploits, and wondered why the Euphrates should mark the edge of their ambition. To conquer Parthia would not only enrich the state, but grant eternal glory to any man bold enough to do it. In Parthia, kings like Mithridates and Phraates looked west with wary eyes, strengthening their cavalry, building alliances, ensuring that Rome would find not an easy prize, but a formidable foe. Thus, two empires circled each other, bound by geography and destiny, the mountains and rivers of the Near East funneling them toward collision. What had begun as distant expansion now tightened into confrontation. The Seleucids were fading, the buffer collapsing. Soon there would be no middle ground left, no third power to absorb Rome's hunger or Parthia's defense. Soon, Rome and Parthia would stand face to face, legion against horse archer, ambition against survival. It would not be a single war, but a rivalry across centuries. Generals would march, kings would scheme, and soldiers would die in deserts far from home. Each empire would taste triumph and disaster, and the memory of their struggle would echo long after both had fallen. For when the eagle met the archer, history itself trembled, and the fate of East and West was forever altered. When the two giants first became aware of each other, it was less a sudden clash than the gradual realization that their ambitions overlapped, that their horizons could not expand without touching. In the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, Rome was already the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, while Parthia, under the Arsacid kings, had consolidated its grip on Iran and Mesopotamia. Their paths crossed in the dying embers of the Seleucid Empire, for the Seleucids had once spanned from Anatolia to the Indus, but by now they were reduced to a shadow of their former power. To Rome, the Seleucids were fading relics of Alexander's glory. To Parthia, they were stepping stones to Mesopotamia. The first formal encounter came not on a battlefield, but across diplomatic tables. Rome and Parthia looked at each other cautiously, not yet eager for full-scale war, but aware that the Euphrates River had become the line where their worlds touched. It was in 92 BC that the first treaty was agreed upon, recognizing the Euphrates as a boundary between them. This was no deep alliance, no meeting of minds, but a practical recognition. Beyond this river lay two empires too large to ignore, too wary to trust. But treaties were fragile things in the ancient world, and ambition rarely honored lines on a map. It was in the east, in the chaos of Armenia, that the first sparks of conflict flew. Armenia, a kingdom caught between Rome and Parthia, was ruled by the ambitious Tigranes the Great. He carved out his own empire, drawing Parthia's ire and Rome's suspicion. For the Parthians, Tigranes was once an ally, but he grew too powerful, threatening their own dominion. For Rome, he was a convenient pretext to intervene, another Eastern monarch to humble in the name of protecting allies. It was Lucullus and then Pompey, Roman generals of the late Republic, who marched eastward during the Mithridatic Wars, campaigns meant to humble Pontus and its allies, but which inevitably drew Rome into Parthia's shadow. Pompey the Great, after defeating Mithridates of Pontus, entered Armenia and forced Tigranes into submission. Rome's banners now waved dangerously close to Parthian lands. To the Parthians, this was a violation, a warning that Rome's promises of peace meant little when glory beckoned. Pompey, ever ambitious, toyed with the idea of striking at Parthia itself. He had already surpassed so many Roman generals in conquest, but the Senate, wary of overreach, restrained him. Still, the damage was done. Rome had inserted itself into Armenia and Syria, lands Parthia considered within its sphere of influence. From that point on, suspicion hardened into rivalry. The Parthians, meanwhile, were not idle observers. They watched Rome's eastern advance with a mixture of caution and calculation. They knew that the legions were formidable, but they also knew that distance was a weapon. The farther Rome extended, the more vulnerable it became. Parthian kings, ruling from Ctesiphon and Ecbatana, prepared their cavalry and strengthened their grip on Mesopotamia. They understood that war with Rome would eventually come, and when it did, they intended to fight it on their own terms. The first real brush of arms came not in a great invasion, but in skirmishes and standoffs. Roman governors in Syria pushed against the Euphrates, testing Parthian resolve. Parthian nobles, ever restless, raided across the frontier. There was no decisive battle yet, no thunderclap of empires, but the frontier began to crackle with tension. Roman ambitions in Armenia, Parthian ambitions in Mesopotamia, and the fragile balance of treaties all created the conditions for war. And then came Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the triumvir who shared power with Pompey and Julius Caesar, hungered for military glory to match his wealth. He had crushed Spartacus, true, but that victory over slaves was not the kind of triumph that echoed in marble halls or etched a man's name in eternity. He looked eastward to Parthia and saw his chance. Here was an enemy untouched, a realm untested by Rome's full might. If he could conquer Parthia, he would rival Alexander himself, and his name would live forever. The Senate was uneasy, but Crassus had wealth enough to bend politics to his will. In 55 BC, he secured the governorship of Syria, and with it, the opportunity to launch a campaign against the Parthians. The stage was now set for the first full-scale collision between Rome and Parthia, a war not of raids or treaties, but of legions and horsemen in open battle. Yet as Crassus marched east, he underestimated what awaited him. He saw Parthia as another Seleucid remnant, a Hellenistic monarchy waiting to be swept aside by the discipline of the legions. He did not yet understand the nature of Parthian warfare, the devastating mobility of their cavalry, the sting of their horse archers, or the crushing weight of their cataphracts. He marched into Mesopotamia believing he was chasing glory, but he was walking into a trap history would never forget. The first encounters had thus built toward something greater. Rome and Parthia had tested each other in diplomacy, had crossed paths in Armenia, had drawn uneasy boundaries. Now with Crassus the rivalry would burst into open flame. What had been a cold war of treaties and suspicion was about to become a battlefield drenched in blood. And on the plains near a town called Parthia, the destiny of Rome's eastern ambitions would be rewritten forever. The year was 53 BC, and Marcus Licinius Crassus stood at the edge of history. He was a man of immense wealth, one of the richest Romans who had ever lived, but gold was not enough. In Rome, wealth was power, but glory was immortality. Pompey had paraded in triumph, Caesar was carving out empire in Gaul, and Crassus, though part of their triumvirate, remained the least admired. He dreamed of matching Alexander, of crossing the Euphrates and planting the eagle standards deep in Parthia. With an army behind him and destiny in his mind, he led Rome's legions eastward, unaware that he was marching into a legend of disaster. The Parthians, for their part, were ready. King Orodes II ruled from Ctesiphon, and though his empire lacked the marble grandeur of Rome, it possessed something far more dangerous, an army perfectly suited to the terrain. Parthia's strength was its cavalry, and under the command of the brilliant general Surena, they gathered horse archers and cataphracts for the coming fight. Surena was young, wealthy and ambitious, a man whose name would live as long as Rome remembered its defeats. He understood the desert, the mobility of his riders, and the vulnerabilities of Rome's legions when drawn away from supply lines and water. He would not meet Crassus in city sieges or traditional battle lines. He would draw him into the plains, where Parthia's arrows would decide the day. Crassus crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions, bolstered by cavalry and auxiliary troops, perhaps 40,000 men in all. He had allies in the region, particularly Artavasdes of Armenia, who advised him to march north, where the terrain would favor the legions and where Armenian cavalry could assist. But Crassus, greedy for speed and overconfident in his power, rejected the advice. He chose instead the flat plains of Mesopotamia, the very ground where Parthian cavalry thrived. It was a decision that sealed his fate. As the legions trudged deeper into the dust, Surena shadowed them, using scouts to harass and mislead. The Parthians spread rumors of weakness, luring Crassus on, while secretly preparing the battlefield near a town called Parthia. The Romans grew weary in the heat, their lines stretched, their supplies running low. And then suddenly the Parthians appeared. Thousands of horse archers, their bows taut, their quivers heavy with arrows, encircled the Roman column. At their center waited the cataphracts, heavy cavalry clad in armor of scale and plate, their lances gleaming. The trap was sprung. The battle began with a storm of arrows. The Parthian archers rode in wide circles, loosing shafts with terrifying accuracy, their composite bows sending missiles that pierced armor and shield alike. The Romans tightened into defensive formations, shields locked, but the arrows rained down without pause. Crassus expected the Parthians to exhaust their quivers, but Surena had prepared for this. Endless camel trains laden with arrows kept the supply flowing. The barrage never ceased. The Romans stood under a living storm, their shields trembling with the constant thuds of impact, their soldiers bleeding from countless wounds. In desperation, the Roman cavalry, led by Crassus's son Publius, charged out to scatter the archers. At first it seemed bold. Publius led 6,000 horsemen, many Gallic allies who had fought bravely in Gaul. But Surena had anticipated this too. The Parthian horse archers retreated, feigning panic, drawing Publius farther and farther from the main army. Then, in an instant, they wheeled about, reinforced by cataphracts, and surrounded the Roman cavalry. The Gallic horsemen fought fiercely, but they were cut down by arrows and crushed by lances. Publius fell, and with him died not only a son, but Rome's hope of breaking free. Back at the main camp, Crassus watched as Parthians paraded the severed head of his son on a spear, shouting mockery across the battlefield. The legionaries, already shaken, began to despair. Still the arrows fell, and still the Parthians harried them without respite. When the Romans tried to advance, the archers retreated. When they stood firm, the arrows rained harder. There was no decisive clash of infantry, no chance for the legions to bring their discipline to bear. It was death by attrition, exhaustion, and despair. As night fell, Crassus's army withdrew to Carrhae, battered and demoralized. Surena pressed them relentlessly, cutting off water, circling their camp. Crassus hesitated, uncertain whether to retreat or seek parley. His officers grew restless, his soldiers mutinous. Finally, a meeting was arranged between Crassus and Surena to negotiate. But the meeting was a trap. Accounts differ. Some say Crassus resisted being dragged away, others that he was struck down in chaos. But in the end, Crassus was killed. His death was ignoble, a far cry from the glory he sought. Roman writers whispered of grotesque humiliations, of molten gold poured down his throat as a mockery of his greed, though whether myth or truth, the story endured. Of the army he had led, tens of thousands lay dead or captured. Some Roman prisoners, it is said, were marched eastward far into Parthia, perhaps even settled along distant frontiers. Others languished in slavery. For Rome the defeat was catastrophic, the worst since Cannae, a wound to its pride and a revelation that the legions were not invincible. For Parthia, Carrhae was a triumph that announced their power to the world, a victory that showed Rome could be humbled. The echoes of Carrhae shook Rome's politics to its core. Crassus was gone, leaving Pompey and Caesar to their inevitable confrontation in civil war. The dream of conquering Parthia had turned into nightmare, and the name of Surena became a symbol of Parthian supremacy. The Euphrates, once seen as a river to cross, became a frontier to fear. Yet the rivalry did not end there. Rome could not forget the insult, nor the standards of its legions lost in the desert. The memory of Carrhae would burn in Roman hearts, a wound demanding vengeance, a humiliation demanding redemption. And so, even as civil war tore Rome apart, the shadow of Parthia lingered, waiting for the next chapter of confrontation. Carrhae had proven one thing beyond doubt. Parthia was no mere eastern kingdom to be brushed aside. It was an empire in its own right, a rival whose tactics and armies could break even Rome's finest. The rivalry, now baptized in blood, had truly begun. The shadow of Carrhae hung heavy over Rome, like a wound that refused to close. The Parthians had not only destroyed a Roman army, they had stolen something far more symbolic: the legionary standards, the eagles that embodied the soul of the legions. To lose them was not merely a defeat, it was a disgrace that pierced Roman pride to its core. Even amid the chaos of Caesar and Pompey's civil war, the memory of Crassus's disaster burned, waiting for a man bold enough to erase the stain. That man was Mark Antony. Antony was no Crassus. Where Crassus was calculating and greedy, Antony was reckless, flamboyant, and larger than life. He was a soldier of raw charisma, a man who could stir soldiers with fiery speeches, who lived for glory and for the pleasures of power. When Caesar was struck down on the Ides of March, Antony stood at the heart of the struggle for Rome's soul. In the years that followed, as the Republic collapsed into another round of civil wars, Antony found himself master of the East, ruling the provinces of Greece, Asia, and Syria, with his eyes fixed on the lands beyond the Euphrates. For Antony, the East was not only about strategy, it was about identity. He saw himself as heir to Alexander, a conqueror who would unite Rome's military genius with the boundless wealth of Asia. The Parthians, in his mind, were the final obstacle between him and the glory that had eluded Crassus. Defeating them would not only avenge Carrhae, but crown him as the greatest Roman of his age. The opportunity came when Rome's enemies in the east beckoned for help. The Armenian king Artavasdes, long courted by both Rome and Parthia, promised Antony a powerful alliance. With Armenian cavalry supporting his legions, Antony dreamed of marching deep into Parthia, perhaps even reaching as far as the Iranian heartlands. The stage was set for an invasion of staggering ambition. In 36 BC, Antony began his great campaign. He assembled a vast army, nearly 100,000 men if the sources can be believed, legionaries, cavalry, and auxiliaries drawn from across the empire. To his mind, the sheer weight of numbers would overwhelm Parthia. With Artavasdes as his ally, he advanced into Armenia and prepared to strike at the Parthian heartlands. But fortune turned swiftly against him. At first, the plan seemed bold and brilliant. Antony targeted the Parthian stronghold of Phraspar, intending to draw out the enemy and force them into open battle. But the Parthians, masters of patience and mobility, refused to play by Roman rules. Their cavalry harassed his supply lines, struck his foragers, and vanished into the desert. When Antony reached Phraspar, he found himself before fortified walls without the siege engines he had relied upon. His Armenian allies, cautious and self-serving, withheld support, unwilling to risk their own strength in a campaign that seemed doomed. Antony's men began to starve. The Parthians pressed harder, cutting off Antony's supplies and raining arrows upon his columns. The legions, hardened veterans of Roman civil wars, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight face to face. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion gnawed at them. Disease spread, morale crumbled. The dream of Alexander faded into dust. At last, Antony had no choice but to retreat. What followed was a march of misery, one of the most harrowing in Roman history. The army staggered westward, hounded at every step by Parthian horsemen who darted in to strike, then melted away before the Romans could respond. The legions moved in silence, their armor rattling on wasted bodies, their banners tattered. When they tried to rest, the arrows found them. When they tried to fight, the enemy refused battle. Men died not only from wounds, but from despair, from the slow agony of realizing that glory had become ruin. By the time Antony dragged his remnants back into friendly territory, he had lost tens of thousands of men. Of the vast host he had marched with, fewer than half returned in strength. It was another humiliation for Rome, another testament to Parthian resilience, another echo of Carrhae. Antony, who had sought to surpass Caesar and Pompey, had instead joined Crassus in failure. Yet the story did not end there. Antony, ever resilient, tried to spin his retreat into a kind of defiance. He claimed that his men had endured the harshest of trials and survived, that the campaign had been a lesson rather than a disaster. He promised Rome that the war was not over, that he would return to avenge the losses. But history was not kind to him. His fate would be decided not on the plains of Mesopotamia, but at Actium against Octavian, where his alliance with Cleopatra and his eastern ambitions would crumble into ruin. Antony never again challenged Parthia. His grand dream of an Alexandrian conquest collapsed, leaving Octavian, soon to be Augustus, to inherit both his failures and his unfinished war. For the Parthians, Antony's failure was another triumph, another affirmation that their empire could resist the might of Rome. Twice now, Rome had come in force, led by men of immense ambition, and twice it had been repelled. The Arsacid kings held Mesopotamia still, and the eagles of Rome remained unrecovered. But Parthia too had learned something. They had seen the persistence of Rome, the willingness to bleed again and again for pride and revenge. They knew the struggle was not over. Rome might be beaten, but Rome never forgot. The rivalry, tempered now by two great disasters, had only deepened into something more than war. It had become a contest of endurance, of wills, of civilizations testing their limits. In the years that followed, Augustus would rise from the ashes of the Republic, reshaping Rome into an empire in name as well as power. He would not forget Carrhae, nor Antony's failures. The dream of avenging Rome's honor remained alive, but Augustus would approach the East differently, with cunning and patience instead of reckless ambition. And in his reign, Rome would find a new way to face Parthia, not by marching legions to their doom, but by wielding the subtler weapons of diplomacy, propaganda, and psychological conquest. The rivalry was entering a new phase. The battlefield of Carrhae and the wastelands of Antony's retreat had proven Rome could not simply batter down Parthia with brute force. The struggle would take new forms, as eagles and arrows clashed not only in combat, but in the theater of kings, envoys, and symbols. The story of vengeance would be rewritten by Augustus, who sought not merely to fight the Parthians, but to outmaneuver them, to make Rome appear the eternal victor even when swords were sheathed. And so, from the ashes of Antony's ambitions, a new chapter was born, one that would reshape the very definition of conquest in the ancient world. When the dust of Actium settled and Mark Antony lay dead, the Roman world changed forever. Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, emerged as the unchallenged master of Rome. He was no longer merely the clever politician who had outmaneuvered rivals, nor the youthful heir who had leaned on Antony's experience. He was Augustus, the first emperor, the man who would cloak absolute power in the trappings of republican tradition. With his rise, the Republic was dead in all but name, and the Roman Empire was born. Augustus inherited not only the vast territories won by Caesar and Antony, but also the unresolved humiliation of Rome and its eastern frontier. The disaster of Carrhae still haunted the legions. The standards lost to Surena, as horsemen were more than military trophies, they were sacred emblems of Roman honor. Every Roman soldier, every Roman citizen, knew that the eagles must be recovered, for without them the gods themselves seemed to mock Rome's claims of supremacy. Augustus understood this well. He was not a reckless gambler like Crassus, nor a romantic dreamer like Antony. He was a master of image, of symbolism, of the subtle power that made men believe Rome's greatness was eternal. The East, therefore, became both a challenge and an opportunity. Augustus did not intend to risk another Carrhae. He knew the strength of Parthian cavalry, the harshness of Mesopotamian plains, and the limits of Roman supply lines. He also knew that his people needed a victory, something that would wash away the stain of past defeats. And so he chose a different path, not the march of armies, but the march of diplomats. The Parthians themselves were not immune to internal strife. Their kingship, unlike Rome's growing imperial dynasty, was often contested by noble houses and rival claimants. Succession disputes plagued the Arsacid throne, and Augustus saw his chance. He positioned Rome not as a reckless aggressor, but as a power too great to be ignored, offering recognition to one Parthian claimant over another, dangling legitimacy in exchange for concessions. It was a game of patience, of political pressure applied with just enough force to compel, but not so much as to provoke all-out war. In 20 BC, the gamble paid off. King Phraates IV, beset by enemies and needing Rome's favor, agreed to return the Roman standards captured at Carrhae. One by one, the eagles that had been carried off in triumph by Parthian horsemen were surrendered, brought back across the Euphrates, and placed in Roman hands. It was not won by the sword, but by diplomacy. But in Rome it did not matter. The people did not see treaties or negotiations. They saw Augustus, their princeps, the man who had succeeded where Crassus had failed, where Antony had failed, the man who had restored Rome's honor. The propaganda was masterful. Coins were minted showing the standards returned. Poets like Horace and Virgil exalted the event as if Augustus had personally conquered Parthia. On the Campus Martius, Augustus built the Temple of Mars altar, Mars the Avenger, where the recovered eagles were enshrined like relics of divine victory. It was theater, but theater that worked. Rome believed it had triumphed. For the Parthians, the act was practical. They lost no cities, no territory, no armies. They had given up trophies, yes, but preserved their kingdom and avoided a devastating Roman invasion. To them, it was a bargain of survival. To Rome, it was the reversal of Carrhae. Augustus had turned ashes into triumph, defeat into a tale of glory. He had proven that victory need not always be written in blood. Yet beneath the triumph, the rivalry remained. The Euphrates was still a frontier of unease, a line not of peace, but of balance. Rome and Parthia continued to watch each other with suspicion, testing their strength through proxies in Armenia, where kings shifted allegiance back and forth like pawns on a chessboard. For both empires, Armenia was the buffer, the fulcrum upon which Eastern strategy turned. Whenever Armenia leaned Rome's way, Parthia grew restless. Whenever Armenia leaned eastward, Rome grew anxious. And always the Euphrates loomed as the border that was both bridge and barrier, the place where legionaries and Parthian scouts stared across at one another, waiting for the next spark. But Augustus had achieved something crucial. He had reshaped the rivalry from a humiliating narrative of Roman defeat into one of restored honor. Rome could now look east without shame, secure in the belief that its destiny remained untarnished. The eagles stood once more in Roman temples. The people believed that their empire had triumphed over Parthia, even though no battle had been fought. In the realm of perception, Augustus had won a greater victory than Antony's armies could ever have delivered. The Parthians, for their part, learned something as well. Rome could be dangerous not only on the battlefield, but in the theater of prestige. They had faced legions and prevailed, yet found themselves outmaneuvered in diplomacy, their great victory at Carrhae reframed as nothing more than a prelude to Roman vengeance. They had returned the standards, yes, but in doing so had surrendered the story of Carrhae to Augustus's propaganda machine. In the contest of symbols, Rome had claimed the laurels. Thus the rivalry shifted into a new phase. No longer was it simply a question of armies clashing on the plains. It was a duel of narratives, of images, of prestige. Each empire sought not only to control land, but to control the story told about them. Augustus had set the stage for centuries of subtle conflict. Rome and Parthia would not only fight wars, but wage battles of legitimacy, each striving to prove to their people and to history that they were the true heirs of power. For Rome, the recovery of the eagles was a turning point, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could be transformed into triumph. For Parthia, it was a lesson in caution, in the limits of victory when faced with an empire that measured itself not only by what it conquered, but by how it was remembered. And so the rivalry endured, sharpened, not dulled, transformed, not resolved, as the heirs of Augustus and the kings of Parthia continued their long dance of power. The legions had not yet marched deep into Mesopotamia, but the dream still lingered. Augustus's successors would look east again, some with caution, others with reckless ambition. For in Rome, the lure of the East, the dream of Alexander, the riches of Babylon, the glory of conquest, never faded. And though Augustus had chosen diplomacy, the day would come when emperors once more sent their legions across the Euphrates, chasing shadows of glory into Parthia's waiting arms. After the careful diplomacy of Augustus, the frontier between Rome and Parthia seemed stable, even tranquil. The Euphrates marked a line both respected, and Armenia stood between them as the ever-shifting buffer. Yet this peace was never more than a fragile illusion. The Parthian kings, mindful of Rome's growing might, watched every move across the frontier. Roman emperors, inheritors of Augustus's vision, knew that their reputation depended on projecting strength in the east. And in the narrow valleys of Armenia, the rivalry found its stage, for Armenia was both prize and pawn, a kingdom forever caught between two hungry giants. When Tiberius succeeded Augustus, he was cautious. He had little taste for reckless wars and no desire to march legions into Parthian lands. His reign, though shadowed by intrigue and suspicion in Rome, kept the eastern frontier relatively quiet. But calm in Armenia never lasted long. Kings rose and fell, installed by Rome or favored by Parthia, and each change risked igniting war. It was under the reign of Caligula that the tensions began to stir once more. Caligula, erratic and unpredictable, played with the question of Armenia but lacked the patience or stability to reshape Eastern policy. His assassination brought Claudius to power, a man underestimated by his peers but determined to prove himself a capable ruler. Claudius inherited not only the empire, but the eternal problem of Armenia, and with it, the challenge of Parthia. The Armenians themselves were no passive spectators. They knew their land was coveted, and their kings became masters of maneuver. aligning with Rome when the legions marched near, leaning toward Parthia when eastern horsemen gathered strength. For the Arsacid dynasty of Parthia, securing Armenia meant securing the gateway into Anatolia and a dagger aimed at Rome's eastern provinces. For the Caesars, holding Armenia meant keeping Parthia at bay and ensuring that Rome's eastern defenses were not threatened. Armenia's mountains, so rugged and remote, became the chessboard upon which emperors and kings moved their pieces. During Claudius's reign, Rome's attention was often elsewhere, on Britain, on the intrigues of the court, but the eastern question never vanished. The Parthians pressed for influence, installing princes sympathetic to their cause. Rome responded by supporting rival claimants. There were no great pitched battles during Claudius's time, but the rivalry sharpened, each empire testing the other, each probing the limits of patience. By the time of Nero, the struggle erupted into full conflict. Nero, often remembered for excess and cruelty, faced a serious test in the east. In the 50s AD, the Parthians installed Tiridates, brother of their king Vologases I, as ruler of Armenia. To Rome, this was intolerable. The appointment placed a Parthian prince directly on the throne of the buffer kingdom, tilting the balance of power. The legions marched. At first, Roman arms seemed to prevail. Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, one of Rome's ablest generals, was dispatched to the east. Corbulo was no mere court favorite. He was a soldier of iron discipline and ruthless resolve. He drilled his men mercilessly, restored order to the legions, and advanced into Armenia with the efficiency of a machine. City after city fell to him. His campaigns showed what Roman discipline could achieve when matched against Parthian maneuver. But Parthia was not easily cowed. Their horsemen could strike swiftly. Their support in Armenia was deep, and the terrain favored their allies. A war of attrition unfolded, neither side willing to back down, both aware that to lose Armenia was to lose prestige before the world. Corbulo's successes forced Tiridates to abandon his throne, but the conflict dragged on. It was then that diplomacy intervened once more. Rather than continue a costly war, both sides agreed to a compromise, an arrangement that revealed the delicate balance of the rivalry. Tiridates, though of Parthian blood, would be acknowledged as king of Armenia. But before he could wear the crown, he must travel to Rome, bow before Nero, and receive it from the emperor's own hand. It was theatre of power, a ritual designed to show the world that even Parthia's chosen prince needed Rome's blessing to rule. The moment was staged with great splendor. Tiridates traveled west, accompanied by his retinue, and in Rome he performed the act of submission. Before the emperor he bowed, acknowledged Rome's supremacy, and was crowned by Nero himself. To the Roman people it was a triumph, a living symbol of Parthia's deference, an echo of Augustus's recovery of the eagles. To the Parthians it was a compromise, a way to maintain influence in Armenia without provoking a ruinous war. Each side spun the story to its own advantage, and the rivalry endured. When the Flavian dynasty rose after the chaos of 69 AD, Rome once again looked east. Vespasian, hardened by war in Judea, knew the value of stability. His reign brought relative calm to the eastern frontier, though the contest over Armenia remained unresolved. The Flavians secured their provinces, fortified the Euphrates frontier, and prepared for the inevitable day when the struggle with Parthia would flare again. For beneath the treaties and rituals, nothing had been truly settled. Armenia was still a pawn. The Euphrates was still a border bristling with watchtowers and forts. The rivalry remained a simmering fire, flaring when kings shifted and generals grew ambitious, cooling only when exhaustion or pragmatism forced compromise. Rome and Parthia were learning to live with one another's strength, yet always dreaming of undoing it. The age of Claudius Nero and the Flavians showed that the rivalry was no longer defined only by great disasters, like Carrhae, or triumphs like Augustus' recovery of the eagles. It had become a long, grinding contest, a struggle not of a single battle, but of generations, each emperor inheriting both the opportunities and burdens of those who came before. Rome could not crush Parthia, and Parthia could not drive Rome back. The frontier was becoming permanent, a scar across the land, a line of uneasy coexistence, but the dream of conquest had not died. Rome still remembered Alexander, still believed that to rule Mesopotamia was to complete the work of empire. And in time, an emperor would rise who would no longer accept compromise, no longer be content with symbols or rituals. He would march deep into the heart of Parthia, determined to seize what Augustus had declined to take, what Corbulo had negotiated away, what Nero had only staged. He would send his legions to the very rivers where the ancient kings of Babylon had once reigned. His name was Trajan, and with him the rivalry would reach its most explosive climax. The early 2nd century AD brought a new energy to the Roman Empire. Trajan, a man of vision and relentless energy, ascended the throne in 98 AD with the vigor of a soldier and the mind of a strategist. Unlike Augustus, who had preferred diplomacy, or Claudius, who sought stability, Trajan dreamed of expansion. To him, Rome's destiny was not merely to endure, but to dominate. And in the east, the land that had humiliated Crassus and resisted Antony, the heart of Parthia, lay waiting like a prize. Trajan's ambitions were as audacious as they were calculated. He inherited the eastern provinces in good order, the Euphrates frontier fortified, the Armenian question cautiously managed. Yet he saw opportunity in Parthia's internal weaknesses. Succession disputes and local rebellions offered an opening. If Rome could strike decisively, if the legions could march with speed and precision, Trajan believed he could achieve what no Roman general had since Alexander, the conquest of Mesopotamia itself. In 113 AD, Trajan crossed the Euphrates. Unlike Crassus or Antony, he was meticulous. His army was vast and well supplied, a model of Roman organization. Siege engines, food stores, and carefully planned supply lines accompanied his legions. Armenia was his first target, and unlike previous campaigns, he moved with precision, securing local allies, installing client kings loyal to Rome, and building fortresses to protect his flanks. The region, once a thorn in Rome's side, was brought under firm control, a prelude to the grander conquest to come. By 114 AD, Trajan advanced into Parthian territory. Mesopotamia, the cradle of ancient civilizations, stretched before him, fertile and strategic, its cities gleaming in the desert sun. Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, loomed as the ultimate prize. Trajan's legions swept aside local resistance with remarkable efficiency. The Parthian army, although formidable, was fragmented, caught between internal divisions and the unexpected precision of Roman tactics. In city after city, the legions advanced, burning fortifications and securing riverside crossings. The Euphrates, once the frontier, was now a line Trajan had crossed, moving boldly into the very heart of the empire that had humiliated Rome centuries before. Ctesiphon itself fell in 116 AD. The Parthians, stunned by the audacity and discipline of Rome's approach, fled before the legions. The city, a symbol of Arsacid power, was occupied, its treasures plundered. Trajan's campaign represented the apex of Roman ambition in the east. At last the eagle stood within Parthia, where centuries of Roman attempts had failed. Rome had finally entered the heartland of its rival. Yet even as Trajan's armies marched in triumph, the difficulties of empire began to weigh. The legions were stretched over vast distances. Supply lines, no matter how carefully planned, became vulnerable in unfamiliar territory. The Parthians, though defeated in open battle, melted into the deserts, harassing Roman outposts, attacking isolated garrisons, and forcing the legions into constant vigilance. What had seemed a straightforward conquest now required more than military skill. It demanded endurance, strategy, and diplomacy to hold the lands already taken. In the same year, Trajan made the boldest move of all. He annexed Armenia and northern Mesopotamia as Roman provinces, integrating them formally into the empire. For the first time, Roman governors administered lands that had once belonged to the Parthian kings, and Roman coins were struck in their cities. Rome seemed to have rewritten the map of the East. The dream of conquest that Crassus had died chasing, that Antony had lost in despair, had been realized. But conquest was not victory. The Parthians, resilient and cunning, regrouped. Guerrilla tactics, coupled with uprisings in the newly annexed provinces, began to sap Roman energy. The legions, despite their discipline, were overextended, forced to maintain garrisons across vast deserts, rivers, and mountains. Trajan, recognizing the strain, planned a further advance into the Persian heartland, beyond the Tigris and toward the Iranian plateau. Yet before this could be realized, illness and the logistical difficulties of maintaining such an extended frontier forced him to reconsider. By 117 AD, Trajan was dead. The campaign he had begun with such vision now fell to his successor, Hadrian, a man far less enamored with expansion. Trajan's eastern dream, the conquest of Parthia, had reached its zenith with the capture of Ctesiphon, but it was not sustainable. Rome had learned that the east, though rich and desirable, was perilous and resistant. The legions could advance and occupy, but the Parthians could endure, retreating when necessary, harrying the invaders and exploiting the vastness of their empire to frustrate Roman control. Trajan's campaign, though brilliant, highlighted a fundamental truth about the Roman-Parthian rivalry. Absolute conquest was nearly impossible. The Parthian Empire, built on mobility and local knowledge, could not be easily destroyed, and its culture of resilience ensured that even defeat on the battlefield was rarely permanent. For Rome, the lesson was equally clear. Ambition could carry the legions far, but the cost of overreach was severe, and the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the deserts beyond remained as daunting as ever. Yet the psychological impact of Trajan's campaigns was immense. For the first time, Rome had struck deep into Parthia, and for the first time, the Arsacid kings were forced to acknowledge Roman superiority in war. Trajan returned to history as the emperor who reached farther east than any before him, whose legions planted the eagle in Mesopotamia itself. The Parthians, though defeated, endured, preserving their kingdom and learning from the Roman approach. The stage was set for a new era, one in which the rivalry would be defined not only by battles, but by the limits of power, the endurance of empire, and the diplomacy that inevitably followed conquest. Trajan, as Eastern dream, was both a triumph and a warning. The East could be touched by Roman might, but it could never be fully tamed. In that tension, the desire to dominate, the impossibility of total control, the rivalry between Rome and Parthia found its enduring form. The legions had marched, the eagles had flown, the Parthian horsemen had retreated, but the game was far from over. The East remained a land of challenge, of risk, and of the eternal dance between two of history's greatest empires. With Trajan's sudden death in 117 AD, the Roman Empire faced a moment of reckoning. The legions were scattered across the deserts of Mesopotamia, garrisons stretched thin, supply lines strained across rivers and mountains, and newly annexed provinces teetering on the edge of rebellion. Trajan's Eastern dream, audacious and dazzling, had achieved remarkable victories, but it had come at immense cost. Into this delicate situation stepped Hadrian, an emperor of calm intellect and strategic foresight, determined to consolidate rather than expand, to secure Rome's achievements rather than chase impossible glory. Hadrian understood the essential truth of the East, that Parthia, despite its defeats, was not a kingdom that could be destroyed. Its strength lay not in stone walls or cities, but in mobility, in cavalry that could strike from afar and vanish before Rome's disciplined legions could respond. The Tigris and Euphrates were not merely rivers, they were barriers and lifelines, channels along which Parthians could retreat, regroup, and resist. To hold Mesopotamia as a permanent Roman province would require resources beyond the empire's sustainable capacity, and Hadrian was not a man to gamble with Rome's stability. Instead, Hadrian pursued a strategy of calculated withdrawal and defensive consolidation. The newly annexed territories that Trajan had won in Mesopotamia were returned to Parthian control, but not in humiliation. Rome retained influence through client kings, alliances, and treaties, ensuring that Parthia acknowledged the limits of its own expansion while preserving the facade of sovereignty. The Euphrates was formally recognized as the eastern frontier, a line of negotiation as much as defense, and Roman governors were instructed to maintain garrisons at key crossings rather than attempting permanent occupation. This reversal was more than military, it was psychological. Rome had learned the lesson that power in the East was a balance of projection and restraint. Augustus had demonstrated that diplomacy could achieve symbolic victory. Trajan had shown the heights Roman ambition could reach. Hadrian, however, recognized the value of prudence, the importance of knowing when to strike and when to stand aside. By ceding direct control yet retaining influence, he stabilized the frontier for decades, avoiding the kind of catastrophic losses that had plagued Crassus and Antony. Armenia remained the central battleground of influence. Hadrian worked to ensure that its kings were loyal to Rome, offering recognition, gifts, and marriages to reinforce the network of client rulers. The Parthians, wary but pragmatic, accepted this arrangement, securing their eastern provinces while acknowledging Rome's presence as a counterweight to internal rivals. The frontier became a zone of delicate equilibrium rather than open warfare, a stage on which both empires tested each other without plunging into catastrophic battle. Under Hadrian, the rivalry evolved from repeated campaigns and humiliations into a struggle of endurance, diplomacy, and strategic signaling. Rome's legions patrolled the Euphrates, symbols of strength that deterred open Parthian aggression. Parthian horsemen continued to patrol the deserts beyond, ready to exploit any weakness, but constrained by the knowledge of Roman discipline and the reach of its armies. Each empire observed the other, learning from victories and defeats, honing the skills of generals and statesmen alike. This period also underscored the limits of imperial ambition. Rome could march deep into Parthia, as Trajan had shown, but it could not hold the land without risking overextension. Parthia could resist and survive, as Carrhae and Antony had proven, but it could not match Rome's logistical prowess in sustained campaigns. The frontier was no longer simply a place of war. It was a testing ground for strategy, patience, and the projection of power without direct confrontation. Hadrian's approach reshaped the nature of the Roman-Parthian rivalry for the first time in centuries. The focus shifted from conquest to management, from glory to stability. Rome had learned to measure ambition against reality, and Parthia had learned that endurance and cunning could withstand even the mightiest legions. The lessons of Crassus, Antony, and Trajan became a guide. Aggression could win battles, but prudence preserved empires. Yet the rivalry endured. The Euphrates remained a tense frontier, Armenia a constant flashpoint, and both empires continued to watch each other across the deserts and rivers, ready to exploit weakness or opportunity. The clash of civilizations had transformed, but it had not ended. Rome had achieved security without total conquest, and Parthia had preserved independence without decisive victory. Both powers now understood that their struggle would be measured not in singular battles, but in decades of careful strategy, diplomacy, and occasional skirmishes that kept the tension alive. Hadrian's Eastern policy set the tone for generations of emperors. Rome would no longer pursue reckless campaigns into Parthia, but it would never abandon the East entirely. The empire's reach would remain poised at the Euphrates, its legions ready, its diplomacy vigilant, a permanent testament to the enduring rivalry that had begun with Crassus and Carrhae centuries before. In this balance, the rivalry became a defining feature of Roman foreign policy, a challenge that demanded respect, a frontier that tested ambition, and a reminder that even the greatest empire in history had limits. Hadrian's wisdom preserved Rome, stabilized the East, and ensured that the drama of the Roman-Parthian rivalry would continue, not in catastrophic defeats, but in the enduring tension that would define centuries of imperial interaction. By the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD, the Roman Empire had grown accustomed to the uneasy peace along the Euphrates, maintained by the prudence of Hadrian and his successors. Yet history had shown that the East was never quiet for long. The Parthians remained a potent and unpredictable force, their cavalry ever ready to harass the frontier, their kings skilled in diplomacy and deception. It was during the reign of Septimius Severus that Rome's focus returned sharply to the East, fueled by ambition, political calculation, and the lure of restoring Roman honor. Severus, who rose to power in 193 AD amid civil war and chaos, was a soldier emperor in the truest sense. His authority rested on the legions, and he understood that military success could solidify his rule. The East offered both a practical and symbolic opportunity. The Parthian frontier had long been a theater of Roman frustration, and a decisive campaign could both secure Rome's eastern provinces and enhance Severus's prestige. Unlike Hadrian, who had favored caution, Severus believed in demonstrating power through action. The campaign began in 197 AD, with Severus crossing into Mesopotamia. With carefully trained and well-equipped legions, he targeted the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, following the precedent of Trajan more than 80 years earlier. Yet unlike Trajan, Severus combined brute force with strategic calculation, learning from the mistakes of past emperors. His army advanced with supply lines secured, fortifications constructed along the route, and local allies, particularly from Armenia and Osroene, assisting in the campaign. The Parthians, now ruled by Vologases V, were initially caught off guard. Severus's disciplined legions advanced rapidly, storming cities and defeating the scattered Parthian forces. His army, hardened by campaigns along the Danube and in the civil wars, demonstrated the efficiency of Roman military organization. Ctesiphon fell under Roman assault, its treasures looted, the city occupied in a temporary triumph of imperial might. For Severus, the conquest represented both revenge for the humiliations of Crassus and Antony and a strategic assertion of Rome's superiority. Yet the Parthians were resilient. Their strength lay not in holding cities against sieges, but in mobility and attrition. Desert tactics, guerrilla raids, and harassment of Roman supply lines began to sap Severus's forces. The campaign highlighted the persistent challenge of Mesopotamia. An empire could capture the capital, but holding the vast hinterlands and controlling the Euphrates Valley was far more difficult. Rome's legions faced disease, exhaustion, and continual skirmishes that eroded their numbers, even as the emperor advanced with initial triumph. Despite these challenges, Severus pressed on. He installed Roman-friendly rulers in Armenia and northern Mesopotamia, extending Rome's influence in ways that were both territorial and symbolic. His victories were celebrated in Rome with monuments, coins, and inscriptions that presented the campaign as a decisive triumph over a rival empire. The Parthians, forced to accept temporary defeats, retained their heartland yet acknowledged the renewed dominance of Rome along the Euphrates. Severus's campaigns marked a turning point in the Roman-Parthian rivalry. The balance that Hadrian had carefully maintained was shattered, if only temporarily. Rome had demonstrated that it could still project power deep into Parthian territory, avenge centuries-old humiliations, and reshape the political map of Armenia and Mesopotamia. At the same time, the campaigns reaffirmed the challenges of the East. Conquest could be spectacular, but sustainability remained elusive. Parthia endured, adapting to Rome's repeated incursions, preserving its core power, and preparing for the inevitable return of imperial ambition. The Severan campaigns also highlighted a new dimension of the rivalry, the integration of diplomacy, propaganda, and military might. Rome no longer sought merely to defeat armies but to control perception. Victories were framed in monumental inscriptions, triumphs celebrated in the capital, and the return of legionary standards emphasized Rome's enduring honor. Parthia, meanwhile, learned to accept temporary setbacks while preserving long-term resilience, demonstrating the sophisticated balance that defined the centuries-long contest between these two powers. By the time Severus returned to Rome, the Euphrates frontier had been reasserted, Armenia stabilized under Roman influence, and Mesopotamian cities temporarily occupied. Rome had regained prestige, Parthia had survived, and the rivalry entered a new era, one defined not solely by battles, but by a continual cycle of campaigns, treaties, and symbolic gestures. The East remained a crucible, testing emperors and kings alike, and the lessons of the past, from Crassus to Trajan to Hadrian, guided both empires in their delicate dance. Severus's eastern campaigns thus served as both revenge and warning. Rome could strike, could achieve spectacular victories, and could shape the map of the East. But Parthia's endurance reminded every emperor that ultimate conquest was fleeting, that the true challenge was not merely to march legions across rivers, but to govern, influence, and survive in a land as vast and resistant as Mesopotamia. The rivalry continued, now enriched by centuries of history, precedent, and hard-earned lessons, setting the stage for future confrontations in a struggle that would outlast even emperors themselves. By the early 3rd century AD, the centuries-long contest between Rome and Parthia had evolved from pitched battles and ambitious invasions into a rivalry defined by endurance, diplomacy, and the limits of imperial reach. The legacies of Crassus, Antony, Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, and Severus all converged along the Euphrates, where rivers, deserts, and mountains had become the stage for a conflict that was as much psychological as it was martial. Yet the world was changing. Parthia, long a feudal confederation of powerful noble houses and mobile cavalry forces, was losing cohesion. Internal struggles over succession, combined with pressures from nomadic tribes to the northeast, weakened the Arsacid kings. Into this vacuum rose a new power, the Sassanids. Under Ardashir I, the Sassanid dynasty would rise in 224 AD, overthrowing the Parthians and unifying Persia under a more centralized, militarily sophisticated state. The Romans, long accustomed to Parthia as the primary eastern rival, now faced a new challenge, one that combined the endurance of Parthia with the ambitions of a rising empire. For Rome, the Sassanid emergence represented both continuity and change. The legions along the Euphrates, trained for centuries in facing Parthian cavalry, now confronted an enemy that retained the mobility and archery tactics of the Arsacids, but was increasingly organized, aggressive, and centralized. The balance that Hadrian had carefully maintained and that Severus had briefly disrupted now required recalibration. Diplomacy, military projection, and strategic fortifications along the frontier became essential tools in managing the new eastern threat. Yet the echoes of Parthian resistance remained. The lessons learned from Carrhae, Antony, Trajan, and Severus shaped Roman approaches to the Sassanids. The legions were no longer sent blindly into the desert, supply lines were fortified, intelligence gathering was emphasized, and diplomacy was used to create buffer states and client kings. The long memory of humiliation and near disasters in the East informed every decision, every campaign. Rome had learned to respect the resilience of the civilizations beyond its eastern borders, even as it sought to dominate them. The Sassanids, meanwhile, inherited not only the territory of Parthia but the strategic acumen of their predecessors. They recognized that Rome could strike with overwhelming force, but struggled to sustain long-term control in Mesopotamia. They, like the Arsacids before them, used mobility, local alliances, and the harsh geography to their advantage. The rivalry became one of attrition, signaling, and periodic conflict, punctuated by brief Roman invasions and equally fleeting Sassanid gains. Neither empire could achieve permanent dominance. Both endured, shaping each other's military, political, and cultural evolution in the process. This enduring rivalry left profound legacies. Rome, having faced Parthia and later the Sassanids, refined its eastern military doctrines. Fortifications along the Euphrates, roads, supply depots, and provincial administration were all shaped by centuries of contest. Rome's emperors learned that projection of power required not only armies, but intelligence, diplomacy, and patience. Parthia, and later the Sassanids, developed the art of resistance, creating mobile armies, fortified cities, and networks of local loyalty to counter Roman expansion. Both empires understood that in the East, endurance often mattered more than victory. Culturally, the rivalry influenced trade, art, and political symbolism. Rome's fascination with the East, its cities, wealth, and ideas, was shaped by the prolonged contact with Parthia. Diplomatic rituals, the exchange of gifts, and the spectacle of courtly submission or recognition became part of the theater of power, a subtle battlefield where prestige was as important as territory. Parthia's culture, in turn, absorbed Roman influences while preserving its own identity, ensuring that neither empire could entirely dominate the other, even symbolically. Even as the centuries progressed, the memory of the rivalry endured. Roman historians recounted the disasters of Carrhae, the triumphs of Augustus, and the campaigns of Trajan and Severus as cautionary tales and sources of imperial pride. Parthian and Sassanid records celebrated resistance, cunning, and survival, ensuring that each generation understood both the threats and the honor at stake in confronting Rome. The Euphrates frontier remained a line of tension, a place where the destinies of empires intersected, and where the lessons of history informed every military and diplomatic decision. The story of Rome and Parthia, therefore, was not simply a series of battles. It was an enduring saga of ambition, resilience, and adaptation. Crassus' ambition, Antony's failures, Augustus's diplomacy, Trajan's daring, Hadrian's prudence, and Severus's campaigns all contributed to a tapestry of conflict that shaped the very nature of empire. Rome's engagement with the East became a defining element of its identity, as did Parthia's, and later Sassanid Persia's, ability to endure against one of history's most powerful civilizations. Ultimately, the rivalry teaches a timeless lesson. Empires are defined not only by the battles they win or lose, but by the limits they recognize, the strategies they adapt, and the resilience they cultivate. Rome could never completely subdue Parthia, nor could Parthia destroy Rome. Instead, they shaped each other across centuries, creating a dynamic tension that influenced the course of history, the strategies of generals, and the ambitions of emperors for generations to come. And as the sun set over the Euphrates, casting long shadows across the deserts and rivers, the ancient rivalry endured, a testament to the drama, the danger, and the enduring grandeur of two empires forever intertwined in the annals of history.